Joining me to discuss the SPP Summit meeting and his research into the North American Union is Dr. Jerome Corsi, author of The Late Great USA, The Coming Merger with Mexico and Canada. Jerome earned his Ph.D. in political science at Harvard in the year 1972 and has authored several other books on foreign affairs. He currently writes for World Net Daily. Dr. Jerome Corsi, thanks for being with us.
Alex, great pleasure to be with you. Thank you.
So give me a brief overview of your biography and what you have been involved with politically before writing this book.
Well, I'm a staff writer right now for World Net Daily, and I do that almost every day. I've written 6 or 7 books in the last since 2004. I had a 25-year career in financial services, and after I got my degree at Harvard in 1972, I did publish books, and I worked in universities. And when I published Unfit for Command, co-authored it with John O'Neill, which was the Swiftboat book about the Swiftboat veterans speaking out against John Kerry. That changed my career, and I've since then been writing full-time on politics.
Now, your opinion in terms of George W. Bush, I believe, has changed in recent years. Can we go over that briefly and then get into the North American Union?
Well, I think, I voted for George W. Bush twice, and I want to carefully distinguish that the Swiftboat veterans were not organized for George W. Bush. There was no agreement among the Swiftboat vets that George Bush should be the candidate that would be elected president. Swiftboat vets were unified in that John Kerry was unfit for command. I personally was in favor of George Bush, and I'm deeply disappointed, especially by the second term. And this whole issue of wide open borders and the increasing integration with Mexico and Canada, which I think is a very apparent agenda of Bush's second term, is just unacceptable to me. And that's why I've been writing about it and trying to make people aware that if we don't understand this and take steps to prevent it, we'll go down the same path that Europe went down over a 50-year period, when Europe began with a coal and steel agreement in 1957, and today ends up with a European Union and the Euro. And if we don't watch it, we'll go through a series of economic agreements like NAFTA. We're now in the Security and Prosperity Partnership, which involved no law and no treaty. It was just declared in the 2005 summit meeting with Mexico and Canada in Waco, Texas. And I think we'll head towards a North American Union, and our elites have even named our regional currency the Amero, A-M-E-R-O. And I think if they can give a name to the regional currency they're heading towards, we ought to take the plan seriously.
Now, I want to take a quick break here, Jerome, and play a quick clip of George W. Bush speaking at the SPP Summit just a few days ago. Do we have that ready? We'll be right back after this.
Interim meeting, a meeting for us to make sure that the strategy that's being developed will be effective. And so we reviewed where we are in the process. The United States is committed to this joint strategy to deal with a joint problem. I would not be committed to dealing with this if I wasn't convinced that President Calderon had the will and the desire to protect his people from narco-traffickers. He has shown great leadership and great strength of character, which gives me good confidence that the plan we'll develop will be effective. And the fundamental question is, what can we do together to make sure that the common strategy works? And that's where we are in the discussions right now. There's all kinds of speculation about the size of the package, this, that, and the other. All I can tell you is the package, when it's developed, will be robust enough to achieve a common objective, which is less violence on both sides of the border and to deal with narco-trafficking. And we both have responsibilities. And that's what the package is entailed to develop. It's to develop how do we share our joint responsibilities. It's in our interest that this program go forward. I hear you mentioned Plan Colombia. This is not like Plan Colombia. This is different from Plan Colombia. This is a plan that, says we've got an issue on our own border We share a
Sure,
border.
sure,
and
sure,
therefore
sure.
it's a
And we have every
joint
reason in the
program
world to
that,
believe this man who appears to repeat
that will
himself
mean-
over
that
the
won't
course
mean
of the
US,
next few minutes.
you know,
Going back
armed
to
presence in your
Jerome
country.
Corsi here, it's funny to see a complete denial in the mainstream media about a North American Union, with the exception of Lou Dobbs on CNN. Have you been contacted by Lou Dobbs yet or appeared on his program?
I've been on Lou Dobbs' show, and I'm very supportive of Lou Dobbs. I've been on the show a couple times. And, in fact, I saw my co-author, Jim Gilchrist. We wrote a book. Jim is the founder of the Minuteman Project. We wrote a book together, Minutemen, the Battle to Secure America's Borders. And Jim Gilchrist was on the show tonight. And so I'm very happy and very supportive of Lou Dobbs' show. And, you know, the clip you just played of George Bush talking was very interesting. It was, I was at the Montebello conference. I went up to Montebello, and I was a press correspondent for WorldNet Daily. I had credentials. I was in the room during that press conference. And the clip you played was from the end of the press conference, and it was from George Bush saying that we're going to develop a military assistance program for Mexico to fight drug trafficking.
Okay, hang on. We are talking about U.S. Northcom, correct?
Well, that's what it gets into, yes. I mean, we're talking about here, you know, Alex, a military continental issue, which should be a law enforcement problem. I mean, I was sitting there thinking, why don't we just build a fence and let the drug trafficking be Mexico's problem, keep the drugs out of the United States, and give law enforcement assistance to Mexico. The Mexican military is losing the battle against drugs because a large portion of the Mexican military is corrupt and working with the drug traffickers. And why all of a sudden do we slip into this continental definition of the problem? And the solution is defined as a military solution in a continental emergency. I find every single bit of that objectionable.
So just to be clear here, we are seeing our leaders on the continent of North America getting together at this summit in Canada, and there have been a couple other summits, and they're talking about joint military action against narco-traffickers. And I find this to be interesting because it is a complete distraction. It is a 180 from what their real agendas are and their blueprints, which you've investigated through your Freedom of Information Act requests that have been granted. So tell me, through your research, Jerome, what exactly we're looking at behind the smokescreen and lies.
Well, what we're looking at, just as in Europe, it was 50 years ago, beginning with a coal and steel agreement. It's the multinational corporations pushing an agenda to create a regional political entity like the European Union and North American Union and a common currency. Because the multinational corporations, and Alex, at that meeting, you know, being there within the press pool, the press were not in any of these private sessions. The press were in the press pool playing, you know, computer golf on their computers until there was a photo op they were asked to go out and shoot. The North American Competitiveness Council, which is 30 top multinational corporations appointed by the Chambers of Commerce in each of the three countries, that was the group that met behind closed doors with the bureaucrats from the Security and Prosperity Partnership in North America. And I think that's really one of the main sources of objection to this whole process. It's not transparent. You can't see through, you know, as I got into Montebello, there was like a 10-foot fence around the whole compound. And that, to me, described the meeting. It was all behind closed fences. You couldn't get in. Not transparent, not available to the public. And the groups that were let in were the business groups that want to have a strictly corporate agenda here. None of the groups let in were objected to the security and prosperity. Where were the labor unions? Where were the environmentalists? Where were the people who wanted to protest this on the basis that it was a not democratic process? Mm-hmm. They weren't allowed in the room. That's a major, major problem with the entire SPP process. And I've argued this consistently, that these continental definitions, you know, George W. Bush leaves the borders with Mexico and Canada wide open. And I ask in the book, The Late Great USA, we're 6 years into a war on terror. How do we have our borders with Mexico and Canada wide open? terrorists have come across that border. We know that because some that were in Dearborn, Michigan, that were sending money back to Hezbollah terrorists in Lebanon, bribed their way across the border with Mexico, and they're in federal prison. And the answer is we're opening the borders progressively, and that's not an agenda that will serve the sovereignty of any one of the three nations involved, or the peoples of any one of the three nations involved, in terms of advancing the middle class and opposing the interests of these multinational corporations that are only interested in profit at any cost.
Let's go into this superhighway that some elements of the mainstream media, including Fox News, are openly denying exists. You sent me today an email with some blueprints, and I'd like to talk a little bit about this North American superhighway. You recently wrote an article about a radar system by the Chinese being implemented, or plans for its construction on these superhighways. I've reported already about the RFID plans for the superhighway and how it's not going to be as open access for the public as most people think, considering the Real ID Act of 2008, which is just right around the corner. So what kind of lifestyle do you think an American is going to have to adapt himself or herself to travel on this freeway?
Well, the highway, first of all, it's the Trans-Texas Corridor, which is 4 football fields wide of new highway being built in Texas. And it's going to go from Laredo, Texas, right up through the heart of Texas to the border with Oklahoma. And Alex, I sent you some pictures, Time magazine and the artist's rendition of what this highway is going to look like, with truck and train and pipeline corridors and car corridors. We've never built a 4 football field wide highway ever before in America. And when you look at those photographs, it's kind of startling. And those are legitimate photographs. They come from the Texas Department of Transportation and Time magazine. These are not extremist conspiracy theory websites that produce the photographs.
So this Trans-Texas Corridor is going to be one of the skeletons of the NAFTA superhighway once the other corridors are built, like the ones in Indiana and Oklahoma as well?
Well, yes. I-35 was originally identified as the NAFTA highway because it is the core highway in the center of the country that connects from Canada down through Mexico. And what has happened is that as the plan is developed to create a North American common market, as it were, that's where we're headed under SPP, and plug it into world trade, we've lost millions of jobs to China on these trade agreements that are unfair, and the goods are being shipped back into the United States in containers, and millions and millions of containers are projected in the future. And what the multinational corporations want to do is bring them in through Mexican ports, which is cheaper because they can unload them with Mexican labor, Mexican dock workers. And those are the ports in south of Texas, like Lazaro Cardenas and Manzanilla. And the containers can be brought up in Mexican trucks and Mexican trains. And the infrastructure of the United States, the transportation infrastructure, is not sufficient without being redesigned. So the Trans-Texas Corridor is the first redesign to build this kind of 4 football field wide container highway, freight lanes for trains with containers, truck lanes, so the trucks, it's all intermodal. Intermodal means the containers come in on ships, they get transferred to trains and trucks. And this new highway is kind of agrees and shows that we're planning in the future not to manufacture anything, but simply to reconfigure our transportation infrastructure to import the containers from China with the slave goods and near slave goods that will be manufactured in the millions.
Let's pause there. I've been meaning to bring this up on this broadcast, and that was exactly where I was going to go next. Can you tell us briefly, before we get into the other elements of Chinese interests in the NAFTA superhighway, give us a glimpse into slave labor in China today?
Well, I mean, it's first of all, China actually still has political concentration camps where the slaves make goods for the U.S. market, including gangs that, Falun Gong, which is a religious group or a political religious group the Chinese have been absolutely opposed to. They imprison them. They make them do slave labor. They sell their organs when they're finished with the people on the medical market. And the people who come into the work camps, like you've got 4,000 or 5,000 people in a work camp making sneakers for New Balance or Nike or whomever, and they're paid 40, 50 cents an hour, made to pay their, dormitory and food, punished, charged fines if they misbehave. When they're 20 years old, they're thrown out because there's a 13-year-old that's ready to replace them. And this does not build a Chinese middle class. It just allows the Chinese at the very top, the owners of the corporations, and in the middle, the oligarchs who manage the corporations, to exploit this two-tier society where the vast majority of Chinese, like the vast majority of Mexicans, are just going to remain poor and dirt poor with no opportunity to get out of it. I mean, we fought a civil war. It was fought over states' rights, but by the end of the Civil War, we decided it was immoral to use African-American slaves in southern agricultural businesses. It's equally immoral to use Chinese slaves or to import Mexico's underclass with the intention of exploiting them economically in places like Tyson's, where they pick apart chickens for subhuman wages. And we've got to recognize this. If this is what free trade means, this kind of unfair slave trade, we don't need it.
Exactly. The mainstream pundits, usually on what is called the right or conservative talk radio today, neoconservative that is, such as Lars Larson and Sean Hannity, when they approach this argument, they try to debunk it, they seem to have a problem with people resisting a monopoly, and they use this monopoly and recall it, repackage it, rename it as free market. But it's not, because we're not just talking about domestic corporations enslaving the American people through the superhighway and through the current trade agreements. We're talking about foreign corporations like Sintra, owned by the Spanish King Juan Carlos, who's represented by a legal firm that Giuliani is the executive director of. So I find this all to be very interesting, including the new information you provided about Li Ka-shing. So I'm very curious for you to enlighten me about the background of this gentleman, Li Ka-shing, the richest Chinaman in the world and seventh largest that is, richest in the world according to Forbes magazine.
Well, he owns Hutchison Whampoa. And Hutchison Whampoa has Hutchison Ports. They're a port management firm, just like Dubai Ports, which is owned by the United Arab Emirates. And Hutchison Ports manages these ports down in Lázaro Cárdenas and Manzanilla, the two ports in Mexico that are going to be the recipient of these millions and millions of containers coming from China. Hutchison Whampoa also operates both ends of the Panama Canal. And the Panama Canal was given to Panama. It was given first time to Panama. The Carter administration, and Robert Pastor was the primary architect of that. He was then on the National Security Council. Robert Pastor is now at American University, and he's one of the primary architects of the North American community, arguing and writing for 10 years, I guess, that we need to give the United States away to this North American community concept that he's been advocating. Now, Hutchison Whampoa, just to follow that trail, so they're managing both ends of the Panama Canal. The Panama Canal is going to be deepened and widened. So these huge super container ships from China, which we're now making in a post-Panamax standard, too big to go through the Panama Canal, will be able to go through the new Panama Canal on into Houston and New Orleans, into Miami. So we can have north-south NAFTA superhighways, I-69 going through Arkansas and Michigan, up from by Houston, I-95 coming up from Miami, north-south corridors to bring these containers into the United States. And Hutchison Whampoa is in a joint venture with Lockheed Martin, Communist Chinese, with close ties to the Communist Chinese government and the Communist Chinese military, and with NASCO, the North American Super Corridor Coalition, trade group in Dallas. Lockheed Martin and Hutchison Whampoa are putting RFID, radio frequency ID, sensors all up and down I-35 to monitor the Chinese containers coming into the United States through the Mexican ports. I mean, you know, Alex, as I say all this stuff, you'd think this all comes from science fiction. The problem is I document all of this in government reports. It's all true. It's just how could the United States of America just kind of fall asleep and allow communist China to have this much control over our ports, our containers, our goods? Well, we ship all these goods to China.
Well, we are a socially engineered consumer class, Dr. Corsi, and you look at the trade deficit with China, and your eyes just want to pop out of your head when you realize that most people are asleep, considering the fact that China, to some degree, owns critical infrastructure in the United States, and they were linked to, I believe, some security for detecting radioactive or nuclear weapons that may be coming through cargo. They were going to use a Hutchinson Wapao. Did that ever follow through last year to scan security into the country?
It's been done. There was a contract given in the Philippines, and Hutchinson Wapao is involved in it, doing the radioactive check of the containers before they get to the United States.
Well,
I devoted a whole chapter of the late great USA to showing how now we've got a $1.3 trillion. China has $1.3 trillion of foreign exchange currency, more than any country in the world, 80% of which is held in U.S. dollar interest. And without firing a single shot, China could bankrupt the United States of America just by selling that foreign exchange currency off on the foreign currency market.
Now, we read about that last week, and we had a lot of turmoil in Wall Street, and I want to get into that with you on our last 10 minutes with you, Jerome, after this quick clip. This is from also the summit meeting on Tuesday, and this features both the Prime Minister of Canada and the President of Mexico making their closing remarks. We'll be right back.
What's the scope of this strategy? I cannot tell you now. We cannot tell you now. We're just exchanging assessments, needs, assessing the situation, and making it clear what the rules are for each country. We will have that strategy. I think it's possible, but we will not be able to come up with it until we finished our discussions and negotiations, which by nature are very complex. But in the end, that is what we're trying to combat, and it's a problem that's affecting Mexican citizens as well as U.S. nationals.
This is an example. We are all sovereign nations. That is quite true. But we are not isolated problems according to our own sovereignty. We have shared problems. For example, drug trafficking. This is a good example. It begins in a country in the Americas or in the Caribbean, but the consequences are seen in the streets in Canada. And we have to discuss these problems. We have to compare our strategies, and sometimes you have to work hand in hand.
Well, once again, this is a perfect example of why we meet. We're sovereign countries, but problems don't limit themselves to the boundaries of our countries. Drug traffic is a perfect...
You know, I think the only thing that we're missing from this is a hypnotic trance-like spiral, Jerome, kind of like emanating out of the TV screen, let us know that everything is going to be okay. I'm not convinced that everything's going to be okay, considering what we've seen with the economy and the manufacture of a preventive move, really, a plunge protection team running in to protect the market, putting $70 billion in the United States, $325 billion by the central banks worldwide to prevent a crash because of the subprime mortgage industry. So give us a view into what we're looking at, and also considering your recent interview where you talked about a possibility of an engineered collapse to push forth an Amero and put us onto this North American Union as a problem reaction solution tactic to create this?
Well, the dollar has lost value against the euro. It's at historic lows against the euro. It's probably lost 20-25% of its value against the euro since the euro was created in 2002. And I've argued to go to a regional currency, to go to the Amero, it's going to be necessary to create a dollar crisis. And we're in the middle. I mean, this whole crisis we're in right now of the, we've seen the dollar at this low point. Now the housing bubble has crashed, and the credit bubble in general. With I wrote about we quit even publishing M3 data. That's the data the Federal Reserve published on the money supply. There's been so much since 2001, so much liquidity, which means cheap credit, pushed in the world to voice the economy of this globalization, that it has to crash. Because in the housing market, there's so much free liquidity, people began making subprime loans to people who should never have gotten loans. In the commercial paper market, corporations got good ratings on their corporate debt that shouldn't have even been able to raise corporate debt in the first place. Leveraged buyouts have been done of companies that should never have been bought. They were losing dogs to begin with. This is all coming to roost now. And as these bubbles burst, it's like when the dot-com bubble burst, there's a huge price to pay. And the price to pay is going to be worldwide recession. Some parts of the world may be depression. And it's not there's no way to prevent it. If the Federal Reserve gives into the stock market and lowers interest rates, like the stock market and Jim Cramer every day on CNBC is begging it to do, if the Fed lowers rates, the dollar is going to tank. Because in Europe, central banks have raised rates, and people are going to go internationally into the euro instead of the dollar, and the dollar will, as a consequence, reduce in value. What this means to the average American is that we're now going to suffer the fallout of this globalization effort. And as usual, the American middle class is going to pay the bill. And right now, we're losing our jobs to China. We've got millions of a Mexican underclass being imported into the United States to be exploited. And guess what? The American middle class has got to pay the social welfare bill. While the American middle class is squeezed on jobs from the illegal immigrants coming in and competing at the lower skill levels, from the outsourcing that's going to China and India. And the average American is going to have to be, in the future, worried about whether they can keep their home, pay their monthly bills, and educate their children. And how many jobs are people going to have? 2, 3 jobs to do this while the dollar deteriorates in value? I think Americans are going to have to come to enough of this and say, if free trade is not fair trade, if it means letting the multinational corporations rule the agenda, and Bill Gates makes another $1 billion by hiring Indian computer scientists because they're cheaper, if the other corporations make another $1 billion by letting Mexican trucks in here, regardless of how dangerous they are, to reduce the cost of transportation, if the corporations make another $1 billion by importing a Mexican underclass, even if it means criminals get in here that rape and kill and gang kill. The FBI told me, I was in El Salvador with the FBI at their invitation. They say now that MS-13 is a criminal gang from El Salvador, tattooed head to toe, machete wielding, working with the drug lords, dealing drugs. They're in 42 states and 2,500 American communities. We've already become a dual country, and we're already importing Mexico's corruption, crime, and drugs. And I think the American people are going to say, like I said in Light Rate USA, I wrote the book so people are aware that this is a multinational corporate plan. They pay our politicians. And, I voted for George W. Bush twice. In the second term, when I see that he's as much a globalist as his father, I'm saying no. And I'm trying to give people the evidence and the arguments and the government websites so they can see for themselves what's going on and be armed to tell our government no.
And we appreciate that. We need people on all sides of the fence hitting them with everything we've got, tackling these different issues, because there's a lot on the table, Jerome, as you know right now. with talks of rumors of war, and more wars, and we're seeing what Russia's involved in with their buildup of the military-industrial complex. So there's a lot of stuff that we have to look at, and I'm glad that you're looking at that. I think people should be prepared for a coming crash and where their assets are going to be and diversifying their own portfolio if they even have any income to diversify, to put it bluntly. So what is your recommendations for anyone out there listening right now who's very concerned about either their stocks or their mortgage or their bank accounts?
I tell people first, pay off their debts, pay off their mortgages. Don't take on debt. It's not a time to buy new houses if you have to be in debt. If you can sell a house and downsize and pay off the mortgage, do it. If people have a little bit more freedom and are investing, get out of the stock market. It's going to be a nightmare roller coaster, and it could easily go down another 1,000 points. Gold is a good investment right now, but not gold shares, gold that you can own and hold in your hands. I co-authored a Black Gold Stranglehold on oil with Craig Smith, who's in numismatic gold, and Craig Smith's whole program of invest in gold with Swiss America that you can own. I mean, I get no interest in saying this. I have no interest with Craig Smith, except that I agree entirely with what he's doing. I have no economic interest in his company or anybody who invests in it. But the idea to own gold that you can hold in your own hands is important now if you've got any investable money.
So just as an overview here, Jerome, before we close the interview, it looks like we have a joint military effort between the three countries in case a terrorist attack breaks out anywhere on the continent, where there's going to be a joint coordination between the countries. Is that correct?
Yes, and I think that's happening with the drug war, and that'll be the excuse, the emergency to create this military continental approach. I was very disturbed to hear this discussed with the last question asked at this SPP meeting in Montebello. And Alex, I think it's a time for us to put left and right down. I mean, my concerns are, I want to see the American middle class preserved, I want to see the United States of America preserved, and I want to put an end to this multinational corporate greedy agenda to buy politicians and to move us to a European Union-style regional government. I say no, and I want to give people the websites of the government websites. I put 30 pages of footnotes in the late great USA, so you can be armed with the government websites yourself and say this is happening. So you can't have your congressmen and your senators or people who argue with you play you Bobby McFerrin music and say be happy, don't worry. You can show them the government websites where it's going on and say I'm worried about this, and let them refute the facts.
I understand this week a report came out that 22 members of the House of Representatives are against the North American Union in some form or fashion. In addition to that, I believe it's 14 estimated states that have proposed legislation against the North American Union. Do you think that they're going to be successful in reaching out? Because I think one of the shortcomings involved in this, you talk about putting left and right aside, a lot of people have a hard time doing that with the North American Union with the immigration issue. And they perceive a lot of people, some do, that are fighting the North American Union as being racist and xenophobics and just not liking Mexicans, which I believe to be a fallacy. So can you go into that and what this really means and how it combines, really, I think, our efforts left and right to fight this, because it is globalization in its true essence.
We've got to fight it left and right together. I'm married to a woman who was born in Argentina and immigrated here legally when she was 16. I speak Spanish fluently. She and her family, before I got together with her, they were supporting people to come from El Salvador and get U.S. citizenships. I've continued to support that effort. We've been married now close to 18 years. And as we get into this, I guess it's 17 years, as we get into this, I'm not anti-Hispanic immigration. I think Hispanic immigration is actually great. I mean, I speak Spanish. But it's got to be legal. There's a big difference when we can screen out people who are criminals, drug dealers, terrorists, narco-terrorists, gang members. We have to be in control of our laws. We could have very ambitious immigration. We could have very high numbers of immigration. I'm all for it. the United States was built by immigration. It was built by legal immigration. That's an important distinction, because as soon as you blur that distinction, as soon as you co-opt yourself into a lie, you're going to serve the interests of another lie, and another lie coming right on top of it is the multinational corporations. And I don't care whether it's left or right. The multinational corporations are paying politicians, the Democrats and Republicans alike, and the media. GM, how many news media is GM and other major multinational corporations, GE, Westinghouse. Just take a look at the membership of the North American Competitiveness Council and ask how many of those multinational corporations pay the major mainstream media. That's why the story isn't being covered. You can't serve a lie and come out of it with any good. I'm for immigration, but we've got to stop this North American Union, this SPP. We've got to end NAFTA and trade agreements with China because they're not fair trade agreements. We've got to get back to supporting the American worker and the middle class, made in America. And we've got to bring home an awareness of the value of the United States of America in order to preserve the constitutional freedoms that we have and the form of government we have, which protects those freedoms. Otherwise, we will have lost what Abraham Lincoln called one of the last great experiments, one of the last great hopes that we have as human beings to experience freedom. And it's not like George Bush says through a democracy. I don't know where he ever got that idea in his mind. We're a constitutional republic. And that constitutional republic respects freedoms that are inalienable, given by God, and we built the greatest nation in the world by building a strong middle class. I don't care how many billions Bill Gates has.
I understand. Jerome, were you an eyewitness to any of the violence between the protesters and the police?
I was. I was out in the streets the first day, and the second day I went into the meeting. I was out in the streets. I saw protests on Sunday at Parliament Hill in Ottawa. Look, the protesters had serious issues, and there were many of them. Some of them were extreme leftists. They still have important issues to say about globalism. The protesters who were there on Parliament Hill were political protesters, the Canadian Action Party, the Council of Canadians, who don't like this non-transparent, closed-door multinational agenda from SPP, and also don't want to see the loss of Canada as a nation-state. And I respect those people. I'm happy to work with those people. The American press downplayed the protest, but it was there, it was serious, and I thought it was actually fairly restrained. It was not out of control or at risk like it may have been prior to 9/11.
I understand. What are your thoughts on that YouTube video that is being written about in the Canadian press and the American press concerning the possibility of provocateur use at the event?
I've watched it, I've seen it. I think it's extremely convincing. I've not done enough of my own research. I only report on things that I really have the
Well, watch
facts
this video
on
back
hold.
once it hits online, Jerome, and we got a snapshot of the boots they were wearing. They are identical. So watch that in the playback, which will be available on Google at a later date, probably in a few days.
Very powerful and very disturbing.
Well, Jerome, I want to thank you very, very much for coming on the broadcast. I'd like to definitely do an update with you in a few months, also on this television broadcast that we're here every Thursday on Channel 11 at 7 p.m. And also I want to get some more people on to talk about what's happening with the economy. Jerome, for anyone that wants to get involved in fighting the North American Union or this new form of 21st century globalization, which is really the New World Order and a new coat, basically still masquerading as the old order, what do we do about it?
Well, I think your show is very important. I think it's a grassroots effort. I'm writing constantly every day on WorldNet Daily. I invite people to read what I'm writing. You just have to go to worldnetdaily.com, and it's there. It costs nothing to read it. I put the articles and everything together in the late, great USA, the coming merger with Mexico and Canada, my new book. It achieved bestseller status. I'm very pleased about that, very thankful. I'm going to do everything I can to get the word of that book out and to continue writing on WorldNet Daily.
Jerome, Thank you, and good luck in your endeavors and your future interviews. I know you're very, very busy right now, traveling all around the world, doing these interviews and fighting this beast. Thank you.
Alex, great honor to be with you. I'll be happy to come back anytime you ask.
Thank you, Jerome. Have a good night.